The heat lay over Albuquerque like a held breath, a fine veil of Rio Grande dust turning windshields chalky and making the morning look older than it was. In a small house not far from the river trails, Carmen Morales moved around her kitchen with the quiet rhythm of routine eggs, tortillas warming, the radio murmuring weather that promised triple digits by afternoon. Her daughter, 15-year-old Isabella Izzy, to everyone who loved her, leaned at the counter in a mint green T-shirt, hair pulled back, laughing at something her brother Diego said about overpacking snacks. She was a good kid teacher's favorite kind, dependable and bright. A painter who doodled stars in the margins of her notebooks and talked about nursing school, like it was already on the calendar. Carmen liked to say Izzy was the light that kept the house from collapsing in on itself. Just a picnic with friends, Izzy promised, shouldering a small backpack. Back before dinner, she kissed her mother's cheek, tossed Diego a look that mixed affection with sibling exasperation, and stepped into the white glare of mid-July. The old Ford Ranger coughed, then caught. She waved one of those waves people remember for the rest of their lives, and the truck turned toward the banked shimmer of the river. The day moved the way hot days do, thick and slow. Carmen kept glancing at the clock, then at the empty chair at the table. When the sun dropped and the kitchen filled with that orange light that makes everything look like a memory, the calls began. First gentle, then urgent, then straight to voicemail. Diego grabbed his keys and traced the route toward the Rio Grande trailhead, jaw tight, windows down. He saw the truck before he knew what he was seeing, the Ranger idling in stillness, dust haloed around it, driver's door ajar, keys in the ignition. Izzy's phone leaking with missed calls like a tiny lighthouse stranded on the passenger seat. The lot was empty except for the sound of insects and the faint hiss of the wind combing through salt cedar. There were no skid marks, no shouting, just the sense of a moment snapped in half. By 8:41 p.m., blue and red washed the parking lot. To Bernalillo County Sheriff's cruisers cordoned off the scene, and an officer, careful not to step where he shouldn't, leaned into the cab. No blood, no obvious signs of a struggle. A pause, the kind that makes even seasoned deputies swallow hard. Then a clipped radio call for a supervisor. Within the hour, the lot sprouted tripods and portable halogen lights, shadows thrown long across the dirt, while officers photographed the truck from every angle. On nights like this, the air itself sounds brittle. The search began as searches do, with expanding rings and methodical hope. Grid teams pushed through mesquite and Russian olive, calling her name until their voices sounded down to hoarse whispers. K9 South strained at their leads, noses working the breeze from the river. The dull slap of water against the bank kept time. Volunteers arrived with flashlights and bottled water. Neighbors, classmates, a dentist from down the road who came straight from his office still in scrubs. Diego moved among them, face pale in the floodlights, calling Izzy into the dark until the word felt like something breaking in his throat. People imagine searches as chaotic, but they are choreography pressed into dessert, a command post whiteboard mapping sectors. Glove changes between each item touched, every footprint photographed before it's obliterated by the next. A deputy scraped impressions near the trailhead, bagged a random bottle cap, flagged a scrap of weathered fabric that meant nothing but got a tag anyway. Because nothing can be nothing on a night like this. Overhead, an FBI helicopter orbited, the infrared screen flickering with phantom heat, the occasional coyote, a jackrabbit holding still because even prey understands that light like that means above. Each blip drew a rush on the ground, boots crunching gravel, followed by the slow unclenching when it turned out to be something alive that wasn't Izzy. Back at the house, Carmen sat with the phone to her chest, the way people hold life jackets on storms they can't see. Neighbors came and went, making tea no one drank, saying kinds of prayers that don't need names. Someone turned off the television because the news anchor's convoys felt obscene. Carmen dialed and dialed and dialed, leaving soft messages that are both question and benediction. Me niga, dam que estás bien. Please answer. Please. The voicemail beep was a metronome for grief. Technicians collected whatever the city could offer. A clerk handed over footage from a convenience store camera that watched the road like a bored sentinel. Grainy frames showed the Ford easing into the lot that afternoon. No tailing car, no shadowed figure darting past the lens, no cinematic flourish. Just the ordinary glide into the last place anyone saw her truck alive. Highways offered their own pixelated shrugs. Night gathered. The lights hummed. The desert breathed. If this were a story where miracles arrive on time, the next paragraph would be daylight and a shout and a girl stumbling out from behind the salt cedar, embarrassed and safe. But the night held, and the beams of 100 flashlights swung like lanterns on a sinking ship. Even the officers who deworked their share of missing persons felt the curve of the timeline bend toward the wrong kind of morning. They will tell you quietly, when paperwork is done and coffee goes cold, that the dessert keeps its secrets, not just because it is vast, but because the first 12 hours pass so quickly you hardly notice they're gone. By 3 o'clock a.m., the line of searchers along the river resembled a procession. White cones of light shivering against the brush, radios ticking with clipped uprates. In the distance, a train moaned, then faded, a sound that seems like a thought you can't quite hear. Someone's dog barked in the houses beyond the levee in the command tent. A sergeant pinched the bridge of his nose until his vision crackled. A volunteer 16, cheeks still round, kept whispering pleas at the dark as if the night could be negotiated with. Procedurally, the case was already shifting. The sheriff's lieutenant on scene made the call most families of missing children. Never here soon enough. This wasn't a runaway, an impulsive detour, a teenage rebellion. The open door, the phone abandoned, the keys too much and not enough. An emergency search order moved quickly through the channels. Contact was made with FBI Victim Services to prepare for the family's needs, not just tonight, but tomorrow, and the thousand tomorrows that come if the news is bad. Patrol units requested additional lighting. A nearby trailhead was closed to keep the curious from standing where they shouldn't. In the background of all this, the city kept its own rhythm, swamp coolers, distant televisions, a wind chime clinking out of time. Toward dawn, the Sandias took on that bruised violet the mountains wear just before the sun decides. At 6:12 a.m., a new shift took over. Fresh eyes on old tracks. Volunteers refilled canteens and adjusted blistered socks. The command post coffee tasted like cardboard and felt like grace. People drank it anyway. On the perimeter, a deputy's radio coughed out a request to check a wash, the kind of arroyo that looks like a scar when the sky is dry and becomes a throat when storms open it. Those gullies are common here, the braided veins of the desert. They collect what the land gives back, tumbleweeds, wrappers, sometimes worse. Around 8 o'clock a.m., to volunteers, both retirees who lived in the valley long enough to know how sand keeps stories, paused at an odd ripple in the arroyo floor less than 2 miles from the lot. Drag marks slight, almost erased by a breeze, but still there if you kneel. They did. They called it in. The tape unfurled, yellow against the pale sand, the circle of observers widening and then hardening into protocol. Boats stopped, cameras lifted. A hush took the shape of a boundary. What the morning revealed did not need words. A girl, face down, half tucked by the damp from a storm earlier in the week, hair matted with grit, hands abraded and nails broken as if they'd tried to hold on to earth itself, clothed askew in the ordinary, cruel way that speaks of struggle rather than spectacle. The scene breathed like it was holding its breath. A woven bracelet, a colorful braid, her classmates would later remember in painful detail, caught on a small ridge of sand. A larger shoe print, a meter away. Looked like the beginning of a sentence none of them wanted to read, but all of them had to. Forensic texts work in a kind of reverence that looks like distance. They moved in careful arcs, measuring, photographing, mapping the drag lines, collecting a scrap of dark fabric snagged on a low branch above the bank. Gloves were changed, then changed again. Bags were sealed and labeled in thick marker, each number an anchor against the drift of doubt the future might bring. If you watched their faces, you could see what professionalism looks like when it is doing everything it can to keep from becoming grief. Word moved outward, as it always does, traveling faster than the coroner's van could. Neighbors turned down their radios and stood in doorways, hands to mouths. Parents looked at their daughters and saw too many versions of the same girl. Carmen, when they told her, made a sound that doesn't belong to any language, and Diego caught her before the floor did. Somewhere, someone said a prayer that got lost in the choking dust of a morning that had stopped pretending. It was ordinary. The science would come silica grains in lungs, pattern bruising that speaks DNA under nails. That means a fight is still fighting, but for a few minutes the arroyo held only the quiet. That follows discovery and the heavy certainty that something had ended here. Above, the sun burned away the last of the night's mercy. In the widening ring of tape and tire tracks, a truth as old as this land took form. The desert had kept a secret until it didn't, and now an entire city would have to learn how to carry it. By late morning, the arroyo had become a small city of purpose. Tripods, evidence flags, and the soft churn of a generator built a perimeter against chaos. The crime scene leader called out assignments, the way an orchestra leader draws sound from a string section. Footwear impressions first photographed, cast preserved, then the fabric snagged on the branch tweezer's paper bind seal. then the path of drag marks measured in careful intervals to model the directionality of force. A second team widened the search radius, eyes low for trace transfer hair, fibers, anything the wind hadn't already claimed. A tech knelt near the impression a meter from the body, larger than Izzy's foot, depth suggesting male weight, angled as if someone pivoted under load. Footwear specialists would later note the lack of a distinctive logo of practical work sole, rather than a fashion tread useful only if a matching shoe turned up. That's how dessert cases go. The land gives you outlines, the lab has to fill in color. When the coroner's van eased down the service road, the hush tightened. Bodies are removed last not because the living want to prolong dread, but because every inch around her could still speak if you let it. A tech slid an evidence collar around Izzy's hands, papering them to preserve whatever skin and cells clung beneath her nails. Another swabbed her cheeks for reference DNA, a future yardstick against which all unknowns would be measured. Only when the checklist was satisfied did the lift happen, slow, deliberate, respectful. A woven bracelet bright, handmade, was logged and bagged. People find it hard to understand how professionals can be so still, so procedural. The truth is, posture and protocol are the scaffolding that keep despair from collapsing the roof. At the office of the medical investigator, the building's cool sterility felt almost indecent after the heat outside. Dr. Harold Kim, a steady presence in a state where the dessert sends too many stories his way, stood with gloved hands briefly folded as if acknowledging the gravity that had just rolled down the hall. The exam began with the small things, measurements, a catalog of marks that would be read later like a palimpsest. The mint green t-shirt, torn at the shoulder, denim dark with damp sand, abrasions on forearms and knees, petechial patterns where capillaries broke under pressure. Izzy's hands told their own story, broken nails, crescented beds, foreign material beneath. The lungs answered the question that no one wanted to say aloud. Fine silica grains and damp organic matter under the microscope material. That matched the Arroyo-S matrix meant she was alive when her face was forced into the earth. Mechanical asphyxiation, homicide. People see the phrase ruled out sexual assault and imagine the gentler end. That's not how it works. Suffocation is intimate, prolonged, a violence that requires proximity and intention. The bruises at her wrists suggested grip on knees, force along the jawline, a struggle that was both desperate and short. The scrape under the right cheekbone, the way a fingertip picks up grit when it tries to turn the head to breathe, these details become testimony later, the victim's body giving answers because her voice cannot. Evidence under the nails was collected last, gently scraped into sterile vials like harvesting a final chance. In 2007, that DNA would be typed using S-tiers and run through CODIS, the federal database that hums with millions of profiles, but is still only as good as the people entered in it. Dr. Kim dictated, and a text pen kept pace, cause and manner, injuries consistent with restraint. Clothing bagged separately for trace. In a tray, the bracelet waited, color stubborn even under fluorescent light. It would become a shorthand in news photos, a symbol no family ever asks for but often inherits. Outside, Albuquerque shifted from dread to grief. Breaking news cut into talk radio, and the city exhaled a sound that had edges. The arroyo, the river, the lot. Everyone suddenly knew these places, even if they'd never parked there in their lives. At Isabella's high school, a counselor gathered a small knot of kids who hacked sleep apart the night before, passing tissues and trying to explain the unexplainable, that safety a promise the world keeps, that morning does not ask permission to arrive in homeroom. Parents texted their daughters to check in and then texted again, as if repetition alone could build a wall high enough to keep incident from event. At the sheriff's office, detectives started the oldest circle of inquiry in the book. Began with who you know. They didn't call it a suspect list yet. They called it a contact tree. Family, friends, the boy who used to date her, the neighbor whose eyes lingered along on the sidewalks, men with records that made their names surface in every whisper of danger. Doors opened to the soft insistence of plainclothes badges and legal pads. Alibis were offered, tested, and penciled into boxes that would later be inked as either blacked out or let stand. Miguel Alvarez, the ex-boyfriend, sat under a buzzing light and told them he'd been playing basketball 10 miles away. His teammates put their names under that statement, and a municipal camera did, too. His cheek swab went into a chain of custody envelope. Weeks later, the lab would say his DNA was not under Izzy's nails. He transferred schools anyway because even innocence can't always ouch out a pointed finger. In a grocery aisle, there was the neighbor, Carl Benson, who liked to walk alone along the river. He'd once been reported for staring too long at a park bench full of teenagers. That was enough to get him a visit. Cooperative. Nervous, the cocktail you get when you rate either guilty of something else or guilty only of living alone. He said he'd been watching baseball on TV. Call logs showed a ticket hotline call. Swab taken, lab eventual, not a match. People glared anyway when he mowed his lawn. Suspicion doesn't retire just because a test result suggests it should. And there was Richard Gutierrez, a name with a 2003 harassment arrest attached to it, a ghost that never quite leaves the room even when the charges do. He lived alone. His story shifted between I was home and I visited a friend in the South Valley. Investigators leaned in. They served a warrant and bagged his boot size close to the print, but the outsole pattern told a different story than Arroyo's memory. His DNA didn't match. His name still made headlines because names like his always do. He walked out of the station into a heat that now felt personal and mean. It is easy outside the tape, beyond the grid lines, to imagine an investigation as a straight shot toward the truth. In the rooms where it happens, it is a lattice of elimination, a ritual of patience. Detectives looped through timelines and phone logs. They requested convenience store footage from miles in every direction, only to find more pixelation than faces. They canvassed the trailheads again and again, asking the same questions because sometimes the first answer is a self-protective lie, and the second is closer to the bone. There were tip lines that rang with suggestions, the well-meaning call in every case. A white truck here, a man with a limp there. A rumored confession in a bar that sloshed away when the bartender sobered up. All of it logged, all of it tugged and tested. Profilers were brought in not because television says you must, but because patterns are sometimes the only light left. The assault, they suggested, was opportunistic but not chaotic. No sexual assault. Restraint marks focused on control rather than display. Suffocation consistent with pressing a face into ground rather than ligature or hand choke. The offender likely knew the area oils are easier to grip if you've walked them before. He had enough composure to stage nothing, no theatrics. No trophies taken from the scene beyond what might have been transferred on his clothes or skin. Those notes will live in binders for years, evolving as the science did. A sketch of a man that said more about method than biography. In the Morales home, the world became anteroom and altar. The living room filled with casseroles and foil trays and bouquets that would be dead by next week. All of it proof of a community that does not know what else to do with its hands. Carmen's phone slept face down on the table now, merciless in its silence. Diego hovered, son, brother, last century against the dark that tries every door when the house is quiet. He replayed the last morning on a loop that made time oddly elastic. The smile, the wave, the promise to be back by afternoon. Grief, when it is young, prefers repetition. It keeps asking the same question as if outrage alone can change the answer. Across town, an evidence clerk initialed a stack of seals. A lab tech slid vials into cold storage, where they would rest behind a door that hummed softly. A small room in which the future waited. Data was logged for CODIS. Case numbers were inked on boxes no one yet knew they'd be opened again years later with gloved hands that trembled a little less than they should. The city drew the day's blinds. The river slid past like it always does, refusing to be anything but water indifferent. Indispensable, always there. In squad rooms and kitchens and one quiet bedroom, where a mint green shirt had hung in a closet only yesterday. People lay awake and listened to nothing. The kind of nothing that sounds like a promise and a threat at the same time. That night, under a sky that looked bruised, a sergeant said what nobody wanted to say. Tomorrow we brief the media, we ask for help, and we brace for the flood in the corner. A detective stared at his notepad where he'd written a single word again and again until it filled the page. Why? By the time Albuquerque's newspapers hit doorsteps on July 16th, the case had already consumed the city. Headlines read like sirens. Teen found dead in Arroyo. Police confirm homicide. Black and white photographs of Izzy smiling in a classroom or holding a paintbrush with her hair tied back stared out from front pages. Beneath, details were thin but devastating. Suffocation suspected. Body discovered by volunteers. Investigation ongoing. Parents clipped the articles and stuck them on refrigerators. Reminders that safety was suddenly conditional. Teachers walked into classrooms that morning with lesson plans abandoned, answering questions they couldn't truly answer. Could it happen to us? Behind the headlines, the sheriff's office was already fracturing under the weight of what they had and what they didn't. A 15-year-old murdered meant urgency beyond standard protocol. Detectives knew their every move was being watched not just by supervisors, but by a public that was already beginning to doubt. The sheriff convened a press briefing, a somber podium, cameras stacked like artillery, statements precise. This is an active homicide investigation. We are pursuing all leads. We ask the community for patience. To anyone listening closely, the subtext was clear. Patience is the one thing grief refuses to offer. At the coroner's office, Dr. Kim finalized his preliminary findings. The language was clinical, but brutal. Death by mechanical asphyxiation, no indication of sexual assault, multiple contusions consistent with restraint, foreign epithelial material under fingernails preserved for DNA analysis. In private, he admitted to a colleague that what haunted him most were the grains of sand in her lungs. She was alive when her face went down. He said quietly, "She fought." Those words would become the refrain investigators carried like a burden. It meant the killer didn't just stumble into violence. He made a choice to hold her there, minute after minute, until her body surrendered. In homicide cases, the first circle is always closest to the victim. Detectives began knocking on doors, cross-referencing names, pulling school rosters, and calling in anyone who had even a passing link to Izzy. Miguel Alvarez, the ex-boyfriend, was first. At the station, he slouched in his chair, defensive at first, then almost pleading. "I didn't do this," he repeated, voice cracking. He told them about playing basketball, about sweating under the lights of a neighborhood court. Video evidence backed him. Teammates vouched. DNA said no. He left the station technically cleared, but scarred. Kids at school whispered. Parents eyed him at grocery stores. His family moved north. By winter, then came the neighbor, Carl Benson, the solitary bachelor 3 houses down. His life was ordinary in the way that attracts suspicion when the community is desperate for answers. He admitted to walking the trails, yes, and being home alone, yes. Nervous but compliant, he gave a DNA sample, sat for hours under fluorescent lights. It wasn't him. Still, neighbors avoided his porch, as if guilt clung even when science didn't. And Richard Gutierrez, the name that had surfaced in files before. The contradictions in his alibi made detectives lean harder. His shoes bagged, his apartment searched. The silver pickup he drove matched closely to a tip from a witness who thought they'd seen one at the trail lot. Local news caught wind and ran headlines that stopped short of naming but did enough damage. But then the lab results came in. Not a match. Not this man. He walked free, but his name would never fully wash clean in Albuquerque. Each time a suspect was cleared, a new void opened. Community meetings grew tense. Parents stood up demanding accountability, voices quaking with both fear and rage. Why can't you find anything? Why is my daughter still safe only if I keep her locked inside? The sheriff repeated the same. Phrases were doing everything possible. Investigations take time, but trust is a currency quickly spent. By fall, many residents were convinced law enforcement was floundering. In private, detectives argued over strategy. The shoe print remained in evidence, cast and measured, but without a matching shoe it was a ghost. The scrap of dark fabric snagged in the arroyo yielded little cotton poly blend, mass-produced, sold in thousands of stores. CODIS returned no hits on the DNA under Izzy's nails, a blow that deflated the uni. "He's not in the system," one technician muttered, "or he's never been caught before." Both possibilities were terrifying. Inside the Morales household, despair began calcifying into something sharper. Carmen struggled to accept official language like mechanical asphyxiation and foreign epithelial material. They weren't just terms. They were the vocabulary of her daughter's final minutes. She clutched the report until the paper crumpled in her hands, whispering through tears. "She fought. My baby fought." Diego grew harder by the day. He sat through every briefing the family was allowed into, taking notes like an investigator himself, pushing for upgrades, demanding timelines. He began attending community meetings with a fury that unsettled even seasoned deputies. "Don't forget her," he told anyone who would listen. "Don't let this fade." By winter, the case hit its first stall. Leads exhausted, suspects tested and cleared, evidence bagged and shelved for later analysis, media coverage that once screamed front page. Headlines dwindled to brief columns buried beneath newer tragedies. The vigils at Old Town Plaza drew crowds in the dozens at first, candles flickering against the wind. Teenagers holding Izzy school photos. But as months passed, fewer came. Memory is a fragile ally. The community slowly returned to routine. But for the Morales family, time didn't move. It froze on July 14, 2007, the day Izzy left and didn't return. And yet, Even in silence, the investigation lingered. Detectives kept the files close, reopening them whenever new technology emerged, whenever a fresh pair of eyes joined the unit. But by 2010, reality could no longer be delayed. Insufficient actionable evidence. That was the phrase used in the internal memo recommending the case be labeled cold. It meant resources would shift. The case would wait in limbo alongside hundreds of others across New Mexico. For Carmen, it was a sentence worse than any court could deliver. She screamed at the officers delivering the news, collapsed against Diego, repeating, "She's not a file. She's my daughter." On paper, the case of Isabella Morales became a cold case. In truth, it was a wound that refused to close, an echo that haunted every arroyo, every trailhead, every family who saw in Izzy's story a warning that safety in Albuquerque was no longer promised. The year 2010 arrived with little fanfare for the Morales family. Only the bitter taste of official words, cold case, to the sheriff's office. It was an administrative necessity, a line of ink marking the end of active pursuit. To Carmen, it was abandonment. She stood in her daughter's bedroom still untouched, the mint green walls lined with sketches and photographs whispering, "How can they call you cold? You were warm, you were life." Each morning she folded Izzy's clothes, pressed flowers into a vase beside the bed, as if by keeping the ritual alive she could stall the forgetting. Diego, barely 19, abandoned his college plans in Santa Fe to stay home. "Mom needs me," he told relatives who urged him to go back. Nights, he sat at Izzy's desk, her diary open to the unfinished last entry, "Going on a picnic tomorrow. It'll be fun." He gripped a pen, tempted to complete the sentence, but the ink never touched the paper. Instead, he stared into silence, a vigil of his own making. Public attention had shifted elsewhere, as it always does. By 2011, Isabella's name appeared only in brief blurbs, tucked into the unsolved murders column. The vigils at Old Town Plaza dwindled. Some years, a few dozen came former classmates, teachers with tearful eyes. Other years, only Carmen, Diego, and a handful of neighbors lit candles, their small circle a defiant act against time's erosion. Carmen often whispered at these vigils, "As long as one candle burns, she is remembered." Her voice carried into the night, stubborn, trembling, unwilling to surrender her daughter to oblivion. But grief has many forms. For Carmen, it morphed into guilt. If I had kept her home that day, would this have happened? She asked, again and again, to friends, to reporters, to God. Reason and comfort could not quiet the weight. For Diego, grief hardened into anger. He cornered detectives at community meetings, demanding, "What have you done with her DNA? Why isn't there a match? Why does her killer still walk free?" The officers answered with the same refrain: technology, limits, lack of resources. The database came up empty. Each answer felt like an insult, like a system shrugging at his sister's memory. In the years after the case went cold, Carmen scraped together what she could. She sold her wedding ring to hire private investigator James Holloway, a man with a reputation for tenacity. Holloway combed through police files, reconstructed the Arroyo scene, re-interviewed witnesses. He found contradictions: a witness unsure of the date when spotting a silver pickup, a report of someone loitering near the lot that was never followed up, but nothing held. The silver pickup belonged to a family on a picnic. The witness recanted, admitting memory blurred. Holloway met Carmen and Diego after nearly a year of effort, his voice heavy. "I've done all I can. There's nothing new." Another door shut, another weight added to their shoulders. By 2013, Diego had grown quiet, his friendships eroded, his nights restless. Neighbors sometimes saw him in the back yard, staring at the stars, whispering Izzy's name. Carmen lived between two worlds, the noisy one, outside work, grocery aisles, forced smiles, and the inner one, where Izzy lingered daily. She opened her daughter's door each morning, straightened the blankets, sprayed perfume that had long since faded, a phantom presence, both comfort and torment. At vigils, attendance dwindled further. Some years, only the Morales family stood with candles. Yet Carmen persisted. She printed Izzy's portrait anew each July 14th, her daughter's bright smile framed by flickering light. "She's remembered," she told Diego, even when only the two of them stood in the plaza, their shadows long against the cobblestones. For them, the ritual was sacred, an act of defiance against a world too ready to forget. Local media occasionally resurfaced the case, often in retrospective features on New Mexico's unsolved crimes. Izzy's face became part of a collage: children, teenagers, women, all victims whose names were whispered in sorrow, but never in resolution. Each mention was both a wound and a reminder. Carmen cut out every article, placed it in a box that grew heavier each year, as if weight alone could measure persistence. But the greatest cruelty of the years was silence. Each unanswered anniversary, each vigil with fewer candles, pressed the family closer to despair. Still, they held on. Carmen often told reporters, "Izzy is not forgotten. I won't let her be forgotten." Diego, jaw-tight, echoed, "This case will not drown in silence." Their words carried through empty plazas and quiet newsrooms, clinging to hope that one day somehow something would break. As the 2010s stretched forward, technology began to outpace memory. Advances in DNA analysis promised possibilities unthinkable in 2007. Across the country, cold cases cracked open because of a single degraded strand, a fleck of skin preserved against time. Carmen clipped these articles too, reading them with trembling hints. Each story was a reminder, maybe, just maybe, Izzy's evidence still spoke, waiting for the right years to listen. By 2017, 10 years after Isabella's death, the arroyo had returned to silence, its sand smoothed by wind and rain. The wooden stakes once marking evidence sites had long vanished, swallowed by dust. To strangers, it was just another cut in the desert, but to Carmen and Diego, it was sacred ground, a scar that never closed. They visited often, leaving flowers that wilted under the sun but carrying prayers that did not. The world had largely moved on. They had not. They could not. And though they didn't know it then, their persistence, their refusal to let Isabella's name fade was the thread that would pull the case back into light. For even in the coldest cases, the past is never entirely silent. Sometimes it waits, biding time, until science catches up with memory. By 2018, the Isabella Morales case existed mostly in shadows filed under cold cases in the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office, a name whispered only during anniversaries or in the margins of true crime articles about unsolved murders. But for Carmen and Diego, time had not softened anything. Each year, they lit candles in Old Town Plaza, each flame an act of protest against forgetting. Carmen's words at vigils had become a refrain. 17 years is too long. Justice must not sleep. Her voice cracked, but her persistence did not. Diego had hardened into a man shaped by grief. At 26, he was far older than his years, eyes carrying the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much silence from the system. He spoke at victims' rights groups, urging the state to fund DNA testing for old cases. "We have her DNA evidence," he would repeat. "Why isn't it enough? Why isn't it used?" Families of other missing and murdered girls nodded, knowing too well what it meant to be left in limbo. The national landscape was changing. In 2018, California investigators used a new method, genealogical DNA databases, to capture the Golden State Killer, a predator who had evaded justice for decades. The method was controversial, but groundbreaking, uploading crime scene DNA into public ancestry databases, finding distant relatives, then building family trees to zero in on a suspect. The news sent shockwaves through the country. To the Morales family, it was a spark of hope. Carmen clipped the articles, highlighting sentences, calling the sheriff's office weekly. "Can you use this for Izzy? Why not here?" For a while, there was no response, but in early 2019, things shifted. The New Mexico Cold Case Unit announced a partnership with the FBI to re-examine unsolved cases, using advanced forensic techniques. At a March press briefing, the sheriff stood with FBI officials and confirmed Isabella's evidence was being reopened. Boxes that had sat sealed since 2007, nail scrapings, fabric fibers. The torn t-shirt were carefully logged and prepared for shipment to a California laboratory, specializing in next-generation sequencing. For Carmen and Diego, watching those boxes carried out of storage was like seeing Izzy leave home again. Fragile and precious, Diego whispered to reporters, "This is Izzy's second chance, and maybe our last." His voice cracked, but his eyes were steady. The lab work began in April 2019. Machines capable of reading degraded genetic material ran for weeks. Scientists filtered out contaminants, reconstructing fragments into usable profiles. Every step was clinical, mechanical, but investigators waited with hearts pounding. If CODIS had failed before, perhaps this deeper analysis could find what was missed. By May, results arrived. No match. The lab report was clear. The DNA recovered from Isabella's nails did not correspond to any offender in national databases. The killer had never been caught for another crime. 2. Investigators It was both crushing and illuminating. He was not a repeat felon, not a man already cataloged by the justice system. He was someone who had slipped through, ordinary enough to vanish into daily life. The Morales family was called in. Carmen clutched a rosary. Diego clutched Izzy's school portrait. The sheriff explained gently, "This doesn't mean we stop. It means we change direction." Diego slammed his fist on the table, eyes brimming. "He's out there, living, breathing, while my sister is in the ground." Carmen sat silent, tears streaking her face, whispering, "Why, Izzy? Why him? Why that day?" News outlets reported cautiously. New DNA technology fails to solve Morales' murder. For the community, it was another disappointment, another reason to doubt law enforcement. But inside the FBI's cold case unit, a new conversation had already begun. If CODIS could not identify the killer, genealogical DNA databases might. Quietly, investigators prepared petitions for court orders outlining the extraordinary nature of the case of 15-year-old victim. All traditional leads exhausted, and a family who had never let her name fade. For Carmen and Diego, hope flickered once more. They didn't know how long it would take, or if it would work, but they knew science was finally on their side. And for the first time in over a decade, the desert silence seemed less permanent, as though Isabella's voice might yet break through. June 2019, the meeting room in Santa Fe was closed to the public, the air heavy with secrecy and the scent of burnt coffee. Investigators from the New Mexico Cold Case Unit sat alongside FBI agents, their files spread across the table like fragments of a puzzle. On the whiteboard, Izzy's photograph, her bright smile framed by curls, was pinned above the words, "Genealogical DNA Pathway." For years, CODIS had given them nothing but silence. Now, they were prepared to gamble on a new science that was already rewriting history in other states. To proceed, they needed judicial approval. A petition was drafted outlining why this case demanded extraordinary measures. It cited Isabella's age, the brutality of her death, and the Morales family's relentless pursuit of answers. It argued that using genealogical databases was not a violation of privacy, but a last chance at justice. In late June, a Bernalillo County judge signed the order. It was limited, specific, access granted only for the Morales investigation, bound by strict oversight. Still, for investigators, it was the door they had been pounding on for 12 years. In early July, a courier hand-delivered the sealed evidence envelopes from California nail scrapings, fabric fibers, the preserved epithelial cells to FBI genealogical consultants. Technicians uploaded the sequence DNA to GetMatch, one of the largest public genealogy databases. Within hours, the algorithm produced its first connections, distant relatives, third and fourth cousins, scattered across the Southwest. Most were too far removed to matter, but one stood out: a woman in Texas sharing enough markers to suggest a meaningful genetic link. From that single branch, genealogists began building a tree. They pulled birth certificates, marriage licenses, military records, obituaries, census data. Each piece extended the web of names, connecting generations backward, then forward. Soon, the tree stretched across Texas, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico, narrowing hundreds of possible relatives into a handful of living men of the right age. Present in Albuquerque in 2007, the suspect pool shrank from infinite possibility to fewer than 10. For Diego, the breakthrough felt like standing on a precipice. When investigators briefed him and Carmen privately, he gripped the table so tightly his knuckles went white. "So he's not a stranger?" he asked. "He's tied to us, somehow." The agents nodded carefully. Carmen pressed her hands to her face, tears sliding through her fingers. "If they found his family," she whispered, "they will find him." The cold case unit's office transformed into a war room. Whiteboards filled with names, lines of red string connecting cousins, nephews, and uncles. Notes scrawled in black marker, rolled out: military overseas, deceased 2010, DNA cleared. Slowly, the branches thinned. By autumn, one name began to loom larger than the rest: Miguel Herrera. Herrera, born 1970, lived in Albuquerque during the summer of 2007. Employment records show he worked for a railroad maintenance company, traveling along the Rio Grande corridor. Weeks after Isabella's murder, he quit suddenly and moved to Las Cruces, 3 hours south, married, 2 children, no criminal record. On paper, he was unremarkable. In reality, his timing was damning. Former neighbors remembered little about him: quiet, kept to himself, silver pickup parked in the driveway. One woman recalled almost absently, "I think I saw that truck near the trail lot once." Around the time the girl went missing, it wasn't proof, but it was enough to darken the circle around his name. By winter 2019, the red strings on the board converged almost entirely on Herrera. His photo, a faded ID copy from his old employer, was pinned in the center. Investigators stared at it for hours, imagining the life behind the ordinary face. To them, he was no longer a phantom. He was a man who had lived among them, undetected, for more than a decade. Still, science demanded certainty. They needed a direct DNA match between Herrera and the sample under Isabella's nails. Without it, the family tree was only suggestion. Gathering that DNA would take patience, precision, and silence. One wrong move, and 17 years of waiting could slip away again. In Albuquerque, Carmen and Diego lit candles once more at Old Town Plaza. For the first time in years, their prayers carried a new timbre, not just grief, but anticipation. Carmen whispered to the photograph of her daughter, Izzy, their closer, "I can feel it. Justice is following your footsteps." The wind tugged at the flames, but the candles burned steady, small lights against a vast desert night. By early 2020, the investigation had reached a turning point. Miguel Herrera's name sat at the center of the family tree like a bruise, unavoidable and dark. He had no criminal record, no history of arrests, not even a traffic citation, an almost spotless life on paper. Yet the genealogical DNA trail led straight to him. To detectives, it was the kind of contradiction that was both chilling and familiar. Killers who blended so completely that their ordinary routines become their camouflage. The cold case unit began peeling apart Herrera's history. Employment files showed that in 2007, he worked railroad maintenance along the Rio Grande, a job that placed him directly near the area Isabella disappeared. His schedule matched the summer months, and then, in August, just weeks after her murder, he abruptly quit. Within a month, he and his wife packed up their Albuquerque home and moved to Las Cruces. No one at the railroad remembered why. Some said he seemed restless, withdrawn. Others simply shrugged. He kept to himself. Surveillance was the next step, though it had to be done quietly. Herrera, now in his 50s, lived in a modest single-story home with his wife, Maria Elena, and two children, Sofia, in her 20s, and Daniel, a teenager still in school. Two neighbors. The family was unremarkable. Miguel drove his silver pickup to work each morning, clocked into a warehouse security job by 7, and was home before dusk. He attended Sunday church, sat in the back pew with his head bowed. An elderly woman across the street described him as the most polite man on the block. Politeness, the investigators noted grimly, was no alibi. Agents tracked his movements for weeks. He rarely strayed from his routine. Grocery, store, church, work, home. His quiet predictability made him both harder and easier to watch. There was nothing suspicious. Yet everything about his past now glowed with unease. Investigators knew they needed his DNA directly, but that required patience. They couldn't simply knock on his door. It had to be collected, discreetly, in a way that would hold up in court. That opportunity came one humid August afternoon. Herrera stopped at a fast food restaurant near the warehouse where he worked. Surveillance officers watched as he ate a burger and drank a canned beer in the parking lot. When he finished, he tossed the napkin and empty can into a public trash bin. Minutes later, an undercover agent disguised as a janitor collected the items, sealing them in evidence bags. The can bore lip marks. The napkin was damp with saliva. Both were promising enough to test. The evidence was rushed to the FBI lab at Quantico. Weeks of waiting followed, each day stretched taut with expectation. Diego and Carmen were told only that investigators had retrieved potential samples. Neither slept well. Diego admitted later he had nightmares of Herrera walking free again, a ghost slipping from their grasp after so many years. In late September 2019, the call came. A forensic scientist's voice on speakerphone delivered the words everyone had been waiting for. "It is a complete match. The DNA from the beer can and napkin matches the DNA under Isabella's fingernails from 2007. The room fell silent, then erupted in sighs of relief. Some officers slammed fists lightly on the table. Others simply leaned back with closed eyes, letting the weight of 12 years roll off their shoulders. One detective whispered, "She fought, and she left his name on her nails." For Carmen and Diego, the news was both salvation and torment. When investigators explained, Carmen clutched Izzy's photograph to her chest and sobbed. "Finally, my baby spoke," she whispered. Diego's reaction was sharper. Edged with rage, he lived free for 12 years. He ate dinner with his family while mine was broken. It's not enough. He has to face us. The match transformed Herrera from prime suspect into confirmed perpetrator. Yet the next challenge loomed: how to bring him in without risking legal missteps. An arrest warrant was being prepared, but the team agreed to move cautiously. They planned surveillance, a structured approach to questioning, and coordination with prosecutors to ensure every piece of evidence would hold. Unaware that his discarded trash had betrayed him, Miguel Herrera continued his daily life in Las Cruces, working shifts, attending church, mowing his lawn. To his neighbors, he was still the polite man next door. To investigators, he was the man who had killed a 15-year-old girl and thought he had buried the truth in the desert. For the Morales family, the confirmation was a strange, bitter comfort. Justice had a name now. While it was still just out of reach, they lit candles again at Old Town Plaza, the flames trembling in the summer wind. Carmen whispered into the night, "Izzy, they found him. We're coming closer." But justice is never simple, never clean. The investigators knew, just as Carmen and Diego knew, that the hardest part was still ahead: confronting Herrera, watching his mask slip, and forcing the truth into the light. Winter of 2019 passed into 2020 with Miguel Herrera under constant but invisible watch. The surveillance team rotated shifts, careful to blend into the rhythm of his quiet neighborhood in Las Cruces. Each morning at 6:30 a.m., Herrera pulled his silver pickup onto Main Street, drove to the industrial zone, and clocked into his warehouse security job. By mid-afternoon, he was back home. Sundays, he drove his wife and children to the local church. His life was a clock wound tightly, every movement predictable, almost mechanical. To neighbors, he was the definition of ordinary. To detectives, that very ordinariness screamed concealment. Inside briefing rooms in Santa Fe, agents mapped out the next step. DNA had already sealed his guilt, but the law demanded precision. They wanted his behavior on record, his reactions, his contradictions, his body language when confronted. Prosecutors stressed, "We need to eliminate every angle for appeal. If this goes to trial, nothing can wobble." The plan was deliberate. First, a soft door approach at his home, presenting the reopening of an old case as routine. Then, once his nerves were frayed, a formal summons for questioning in Santa Fe. On a damp morning in July 2019, 3 unmarked cars parked outside Herrera's adobe-style house. When he opened the door, he froze at the sight of badges. For a moment, he smiled faintly. Too quickly, "What's this about?" he asked, fingers whitening as they gripped the frame. His voice wavered, not confusion, but calculation. Agents noted every flicker. They sat in his living room. A Christmas photo hung on the wall, Herrera with his wife and children, smiling. Unremarkable, the picture of suburban decency. The contrast was suffocating. Investigators asked simple questions. "Did you live in Albuquerque in 2007? "Yes, just a few months. "For work?" He replied, eyes darting. "Did you remember July of that year?" "Not clearly. It's been too long." He insisted he was home, but employment records already showed him working shifts along the Rio Grande corridor that summer. The more they pressed, the more he unraveled. Sweat beaded at his temples despite the hum of the air conditioner. His voice cracked when he denied knowing Isabella Morales. When asked if he'd ever seen her picture before, he shook his head quickly. Then, almost carelessly, he said, "I don't remember her face clearly," a contradiction. How could one not remember someone they claimed never to have seen? Finally, investigators asked him to accompany them to Santa Fe for formal questioning. He hesitated, lips pressed tight, then nodded. "Fine, I'll go," he whispered, his voice drained of confidence. They left him trembling at the door, his hands shaking so much he struggled with the handle. Neighbors noticed his change immediately. Maria Elena, his wife, confided later to police that Miguel stopped eating, chain smoked through the night, and walked the hallways muttering to himself. A neighbor across the street recalled, "He looked like he'd seen a ghost." In truth, the ghost was real. It was Izzy, clawing her way back through the evidence he thought the desert had buried forever. 2 days later, Miguel Herrera arrived at the FBI office in Santa Fe. The interrogation room was stripped to essentials: a table, 3 chairs, harsh white light that allowed no shadows. Agents Robert Lane and Jennifer Cruz sat across from him, joined by a behavioral specialist. Herrera's face was pale, his hands jittering against the steel table. The questions started gently: his railroad job, his move to Las Cruces, His life since. His answers wavered between vague and contradictory. Then Agent Cruz slid a thick file across the table. Inside, the DNA results. She said clearly, "We have scientific proof. Your DNA from the beer can and napkin matches the DNA under Isabella's fingernails." The air went heavy. Herrera stared, then gave a dry, brittle laugh. "This is a setup. You planted it. You swapped the samples." His words came fast, desperate, but his body betrayed him. Sweat ran down his neck. His hands trembled so violently he could barely grip the coffee mug when pressed again. He stammered weak excuses. Maybe someone stole his belongings. Maybe contamination at the lab. None of it held. He refused to meet their eyes. At one point, he pushed his chair back, voice breaking. "I want a lawyer." The interview ended without confession, but the behavioral specialist noted every tell: denial, evasion, panic textbook signs of guilt. As Herrera walked out, his face ashen, Lane leaned forward and said softly, "DNA doesn't lie. Miguel, you can stay silent." But as he spoke through her fight, "We're not stopping." Herrera left the building hunched, his mask cracked. Investigators were certain of one thing: the man who had hidden in plain sight for 12 years was unraveling. What no one knew then was how quickly that unraveling would end. Within days, Herrera would make a choice that stole from the Morales family the one thing they still wanted most: answers from his own mouth. The morning of July 13th, 2024, the quiet neighborhood in Las Cruces stirred awake to the usual rhythm of sprinklers ticking and birdsong echoing against stucco walls. But inside Miguel Herrera's garage, silence had settled heavy and final. His wife, Maria Elena, stepped out to find the door ajar. The acrid smell hit first gunpowder mixed with oil and dust. Then her eyes found him. Herrera lay collapsed on the concrete, a handgun at his side, his body slack in the dim light. She screamed, collapsing against the doorframe, the sound sharp enough to draw neighbors from their homes. Calls to 911 came in frantic, voices stumbling over one another. Gunshot, man down, hurry. Within minutes, patrol cars, ambulances, and forensic vans crowded the once quiet street. Yellow tape cordoned off the driveway where children had once ridden bicycles. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering in disbelief. The scene was clinical to investigators. No sign of struggle. The weapon, a legally registered handgun, lay within reach of his hand. On a nearby workbench sat a scrap of paper with just a few scribbled words. "I am sorry. I can't take it anymore." No mention of Isabella. No admission of guilt. Just a vague apology, a coward's parting note. When word spread that Miguel Herrera had died by his own hand, shock rippled across New Mexico. Local news broadcasts interrupted programming, showing aerial shots of the cul-de-sac swarming with flashing lights. Anchors spoke with measured gravity. The man recently under investigation in the 2007 murder of teenager Isabella Morales has taken his life. The word investigation hung heavy. Sparking outrage, people wanted the headline to read the killer, not the suspect. But the courts had not yet caught up to science. For the Morales family, the news was a blow that twisted relief into fresh torment. When Diego heard, he slammed his fist on the kitchen table so hard a picture frame shattered. He died easily. He seethed. 17 years he lived free. He ate with his family, went to church, smiled at neighbors, and when the truth caught up, he chose the coward's way out. He escaped. Again, Carmen collapsed into tears, clutching Izzy's photograph against her chest. Her sobs broke into whispers. He took the truth with him. I wanted to hear him say why. I wanted to look into his eyes and ask why he chose my daughter. Now I'll never know. Her grief, already unbearable, was sharpened by the theft of answers. The next day, investigators faced the media. An FBI spokesperson confirmed what they had long held close: the DNA from the crime scene matched Miguel Herrera beyond doubt. Though Herrera's death prevents trial, the forensic evidence is conclusive. He said, "We can state with certainty he was responsible for Isabella Morales' murder." Cameras flashed. Reporters pressed. Why wasn't he arrested earlier? Could this have been prevented? Officials responded cautiously, stressing legal procedure, the time required for genealogical work, and the need for airtight evidence. Their words, though measured, could not ease the frustration of a public denied the catharsis of a trial in Las Cruces. The Herrera family was consumed by disbelief. Maria Elena, his widow, insisted, through tears, he was a loving husband and father. I never saw darkness in him. I can't believe he did this. Their daughter Sophia, now in her 20s, told reporters, "My father raised me. He came to every recital, every graduation. I don't understand how this can be true." Their son, Daniel, barely out of high school, refused to speak, his silence heavier than words. Neighbors whispered uneasily. Some defended him as polite, dependable, quiet. Others admitted that, looking back, his distance had always felt strange, as though something lay tightly locked beneath the surface. For many, the revelation was terrifying, a reminder that monsters do not always come with warnings. Sometimes they lived next door, waving from the driveway. In Albuquerque, the community that had mourned Isabella 17 years earlier lit candles once more. This time, the plaza was filled with anger as much as grief. A mother of a teenage girl told a reporter, "He stole Izzy's life, and now he stole justice from us. We'll never see him answer for what he did." The candles flickered, a fragile stand against the desert wind, their flames carrying the questions Miguel Herrera had buried with himself. For investigators, Herrera's suicide was not closure, it was a bitter comma, not a period. They still had to confirm, with absolute certainty, that every strand of evidence pointed only to him. Postmortem DNA samples from his body were rushed to Quantico, retested against Isabella's evidence using multiple methods. Scientists double-checked with STR analysis, YSTR male markers, and next-generation sequencing. The results came back identical to the crime scene. The odds of another man sharing his profile were less than 1 in a billion. Science left no room for doubt, but science could not answer the questions that haunted Carmen and Diego in their sleepless nights. Why had he chosen Izzy? Was it random? Was it opportunity? Had there been other victims? In the garage, where Herrera ended his life, no diary was found. Numbered notes beyond that single scrawl of apology. His secrets, if there were more, had died with him. The case that had consumed New Mexico for nearly 2 decades now had a name, a face, and a grave ending, but it lacked the confession, the reckoning, the courtroom moment the Morales family had prayed for. For them, justice had come, but it was hollow, unsatisfying, and cruelly incomplete. July 20th, 2024. The press conference in Albuquerque drew reporters from every major outlet across New Mexico. At the front of the room stood a large easel, bearing a photo of 15-year-old Isabella Izzy Morales, her mint green shirt glowing even under the harsh artificial lights. Beside it sat a sealed evidence folder, stamped with the FBI crest. The Bernalillo County Sheriff stepped to the podium, cleared his throat, and delivered the words the Morales family had been waiting 17 years to hear. After exhaustive analysis, we can confirm with certainty that Miguel Herrera murdered Isabella Morales in 2007. This case is now officially closed. For several seconds, silence hung over the room. Then the sound of keyboards, shutters, and hushed murmurs broke loose. The press had its headline. But for Carmen and Diego Morales, seated in the front row, the moment was more than news. Carmen clutched her daughter's framed photograph as though shielding it, tears falling openly. Diego sat rigid, fist clenched on his knees, his eyes red but unflinching. When the sheriff invited them to speak, Carmen rose slowly. Her hands trembled as she gripped the microphone. 17 years, she said, her voice raw but steady. 17 years of waiting, of crying, of begging for answers, and today we are told justice has come. But it came too late. Too late for Izzy to grow up, too late for her to laugh again, and too late for us to ask the only question that matters. Why? Why did he choose her? Her words dissolved into sobs, and the room filled with hardened reporters and seasoned officers bowed its collected head. Diego followed. His voice was sharper, edged with fury. "He stole my sister's life, and when he was caught, he stole justice too. He killed himself before we could face him. He died too easily. He got to live free for 17 years while my sister lay in the ground. Now he escapes again." The applause that followed wasn't celebratory, it was a communal exhale of shared rage and sorrow. Outside, crowds gathered with candles at Old Town Plaza, the same place Carmen had stood year after year with dwindling vigils. This time the square glowed, with hundreds of lights. Children held signs that read "Justice for Izzy." Neighbors who remembered her laugh, classmates now grown adults. Strangers moved by her story all came together. The plaza, once a lonely stage for Carmen's whispered promises, had transformed into a chorus of remembrance, but beneath the relief lingered unease. Without a trial, the community had been denied its reckoning. Miguel Herrera would never face cross-examination, never hear the evidence spoken aloud in a courtroom. Never sit across from the Morales family and feel the weight of their eyes. His suicide robbed them of answers. Was Izzy his only victim? Did he stalk her? Was it opportunity? Or was it planned? These questions would remain forever sealed, carried into the grave with him. In Los Cruces, the aftermath was darker still. Herrera's wife, Maria Elena, broke her silence through tears. I never knew. I lived with him, loved him, raised children with him. I had no idea what he did. Their daughter Sophia wept as she told a reporter. He was my father. He drove me to school, sat at my graduation. How do I reconcile that with this? Their son Daniel refused to speak at all. A boy crushed by the sudden transformation of his father into a monster in the eyes of the world. Neighbors whispered on porches, some still defending the man they had known, others admitting unease that now felt like foresight. The FBI's behavioral analysts began probing further. They questioned whether Herrera might have killed before or after Izzy. His job with the railroad had taken him across New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, even into Texas. Cold case files from 1995 to 2010 were reopened, especially those involving young women found near tracks, suffocated or left in arroyos. Patterns emerged to faint for indictment. But troubling, investigators spoke cautiously to the press. We cannot rule out other victims. We are actively reviewing unsolved cases. The possibility of a serial predator hiding in plain sight hung over the state like a storm cloud. For Carmen, the thought was unbearable. I want justice for any other family he may have hurt, she said at an interview. But selfishly, part of me hopes he only took my Izzy, that the pain isn't multiplied. Diego, hardened by years of loss, felt differently. If he killed others, then his death was too easy. He took every answer with him. Every family will feel the same emptiness we do. The Morales case became a symbol, not only a personal tragedy, but a systemic failure and progress. Failure in 2007, when evidence sat dormant, when suspects were paraded and cleared while the real killer slipped away. Progress in 2019 and beyond, when science reached into a box of old evidence and pulled out the truth. At the state legislature, lawmakers debated funding increases for forensic labs. One representative held up Izzy's photo on the chamber floor and declared, no family should wait 17 years for justice. Nationally, Izzy's story caught fire. News networks replayed Carmen S. words. Justice came too late. And Diego S. bitter declaration. He died too easily, over and over. True crime podcasts dedicated entire episodes to her case, narrating the haunting details, the abandoned Ford Ranger, the drag marks in the arroyo, the DNA under her nails. Listeners across the country wrote messages of sorrow and solidarity. For many, Izzy became a symbol of resilience, the girl who fought, whose fingernails preserved the truth when everything else failed. In Albuquerque, the plaza vigils took on new meaning. No longer just a mother and son clinging to memory, but a community standing for every cold case. Left in silence, Diego often addressed the crowd, his voice carrying into the night. Izzy fought. She left her mark, as she forced her killer into the light. Don't let her be forgotten. Yet inside their home, silence still reigned. Carmen still entered Izzy's room each morning, still smoothed her blankets, still whispered to her photograph. Justice had come, but not closure. Herrera's death meant the final chapter was written, without the answers they had begged for. And so the Morales family carried both relief and rage, victory and void, knowing that justice had been delayed, distorted, and ultimately stolen by a bullet in a dark garage. The case was closed, yes, but for Carmen and Diego, the story was not over. It never would be. By September 2024, nearly 3 months after Miguel Herrera's suicide, the Bernalillo County Court convened a special public hearing. It was not a trial. There would be no defendant, no verdict, no sentencing, but it was a symbolic closing of the record, a chance for the evidence to be entered into the public record, and for the community to face, together, the truth that had taken 17 years to surface. From early morning, crowds gathered outside the courthouse steps, candles and white flowers in hand. Handmade signs bore Isabella's smiling face, with words scrawled across poster board. Justice for Izzy, never forgotten. The plaza swelled with people, former classmates, now adults. Parents who had kept their children close since 2007. Strangers who had followed the case through years of headlines and silence. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, their cameras trained on the courthouse doors. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Carmen wore black, her daughter's portrait clutched tightly against her chest. Diego sat beside her, his jaw tense, his eyes sharp with the fury time had never dulled. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The prosecutor rose, summarizing the case for the record. The abandoned Ford Ranger, the body found in the arroyo, the DNA preserved under Izzy's nails, and the genealogical work that traced it all back to Miguel Herrera. The science is unequivocal, he said firmly. There is no doubt as to the killer's identity. The judge's voice carried a solemn weight. Justice may come late, but today it has arrived. This case is formally closed. Miguel Herrera is identified as the perpetrator. The room, already tense, erupted into quiet sobs and murmurs. Some clapped softly, not out of celebration, but as if affirming the end of a long, bitter chapter. When Carmen was invited to speak, she rose on unsteady legs. Her hands trembled as she gripped the microphone. For 17 years, I'd have lived in darkness, she said. Every morning I woke wondering if anyone remembered my daughter. Today, I know the world remembers her name. But this justice came too late for her to grow, to love, to live, too late for me to hear why. Why did he choose her? That answer died with him. Her voice cracked, and the gallery wept with her. Diego followed, his tone more cutting. I thank those who never gave up, he said, glaring toward the prosecution table. But I will never forgive the delays, the excuses. If this work had been done in 2007, if technology had been applied earlier, maybe we wouldn't have waited 17 years. And Herrera, he died easily. He avoided trial, avoided our gaze, avoided hearing Izzy's name in court. He escaped again, but at least now the truth is carved into history. He is the one. My sister fought, and her fight spoke louder than his silence. His words ignited murmurs of agreement. Some in the gallery even shouted, "Justice for Izzy." The hearing soon shifted into something larger than the case itself. Citizens and advocates took the floor. One mother stood, voice trembling with anger. How many more families are waiting in the dark because cases go cold? How many killers walk free because evidence is shelved? Reporters scribbled furiously as the sheriff's representative admitted, back then, we lacked resources and technology. That was our failure. We cannot undo it, but we can learn from it. The room buzzed with both grief and determination. When the gavel finally struck, the courthouse spilled its crowd onto the plaza outside, where a candlelight vigil had already begun. Hundreds of small flames flickered against the desert wind. Reflecting off tear-streaked faces, Carmen stood in the center, her daughter's photo held high, whispering through sobs, "Izzy, today the whole city says your name." Diego placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze fixed on the fading sunlight. For the first time in 17 years, the weight he carried seemed to shift, if only slightly. The public hearing gave the case its final legal punctuation, but more importantly, it transformed Isabella Morales from just another name in a cold file into a similar reminder that even justice delayed can still echo powerfully when it arrives. The community left that evening with a collective vow: her story would not fade into silence again. The weeks after the courthouse hearing revealed a sobering truth. Though the case was legally closed, its shadows stretched far beyond Albuquerque. FBI analysts quietly reopened unsolved files from 1995 through 2010, searching for patterns that might link to Miguel Herrera's movements. His job with the railroad had taken him across New Mexico, into Arizona, Colorado, and Texas. Investigators began cross-referencing old police reports with his work schedules and known addresses. The focus narrowed on cases with striking similarities to Izzy's, young women or teens, found in isolated areas near tracks or arroyos, no sexual assault, but evidence of violent restraint. One file from El Paso in 2005 described a girl suffocated in sandy soil. Another from Santa Rosa in 1998 told of a teenager who vanished near the railroad and whose body was discovered weeks later, cause of death undetermined. Each case stirred unease. Were these coincidences or echoes of Herrera's hand? Detectives interviewed former co-workers from Herrera's railroad days. They described him as punctual, diligent, but aloof. A man who drank his coffee alone and left gatherings early. One recalled, he was polite but cold, like he never really wanted to be there. At the time, no one suspected anything. In retrospect, his silence seemed heavier, as though he lived with something locked deep inside. Forensic teams began retesting evidence from old cases. Some DNA samples had degraded, others were lost in the chaos of time, but investigators clung to hope that, just as Izzy's nails had spoken, some forgotten trace might yield a match. In late 2024, the FBI issued a preliminary report. No direct evidence tied Herrera to other murders, but several remained under active review. It was both a relief and a frustration. Relief that he might not have been a serial predator. Frustration that certainly would likely never come, since the one man who could answer those questions had taken them to his grave. The Morales family wrestled with this revelation. Carmen admitted in an interview, "Part of me wants to believe Izzy was his only victim, that no other mother feels what I feel. But another part of me fears the truth is worse, that there are more families living in the dark, robbed of answers." Diego's voice was harder. If he killed others, then his death was an escape. He robbed those families of the truth too. He took everything with him. Meanwhile, in Los Cruces, the Herrera family lived under a cloud of suspicion and shame. Maria Elena rarely left the house. Her daughter Sophia wrote a public letter pleading for compassion. "We lost a father and husband, but we also lost the man we thought he was. Please don't blame us for what we didn't know." Still, whispers lingered. In grocery stores and church pews, people eyed them with unease, as though guilt could transfer by proximity. In Albuquerque, however, Isabella's memory blossomed into something larger than grief. Candlelight vigils at Old Town Plaza grew into statewide gatherings. Each July, hundreds, sometimes thousands, brought flowers and lit candles, not just for Izzy, but for every victim still waiting in silence. Her case had become a rallying point, a reminder that persistence, technology, and community pressure could pierce even the coldest files. Nationally, the Morales story was adopted by advocates for forensic funding. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers cited Izzy's name during hearings on backlogged DNA kits and underfunded labs. One senator declared, "This child fought back. She left DNA that could speak." But for 12 years, it sat unheard. We owe her family and every family the promise that evidence will not wait for justice. Still, for Carmen and Diego, none of the speeches, vigils, or documentaries could soften the sharp edge of loss. Each night Carmen sat in Izzy's room, whispering prayers into the quiet. Diego often stood in the backyard, staring at the desert stars, replaying the last words he heard from his sister, "I'll be back before the afternoon." Justice had come, yes, but closure was a myth. The Morales family carried both truth and emptiness, bound together by the knowledge that some wounds never heal, and some answers remain forever buried in silence. By the fall of 2024, the name Isabella Morales was no longer confined to Albuquerque headlines. It had become shorthand for the resilience of families who refused to let their loved ones disappear into forgotten case files. Her story appeared on national morning shows, late-night talk programs, and was dissected in documentaries and podcasts. What had once been a local nightmare was now a mirror reflecting the cracks in America's justice system. True crime forums buzzed with debate. How had Miguel Herrera evaded suspicion for so long? How had police missed the chance to act on early evidence, the shoe print, the torn fabric, the DNA under Izzy's nails? And why had it taken 17 years for technology and willpower to finally intersect? Some commenters expressed rage at the system, while others praised the dogged persistence of the Morales family. One viral post read, "Izzy fought back. She didn't die in silence. Her nails carried the truth," until the world was ready to listen. In Albuquerque, vigils turned into marches. Community leaders carried candles through downtown streets, chanting Izzy's name alongside those of other victims whose cases remained cold. At the front, Carmen walked slowly, gripping her daughter's framed photo like a banner. Diego often addressed the crowd afterward, his voice hoarse but unwavering. "For 17 years, they told us to wait. We will never accept waiting again. Justice delayed is justice denied." His words lit a fire that spread beyond New Mexico, fueling advocacy groups pushing for reforms nationwide. The cultural wave reached classrooms and universities. In Albuquerque high schools, teachers used Izzy's story as a case study not only in forensic science, but in civic responsibility. Guest speakers from the cold case unit explained the power of DNA, while counselors spoke about grief, resilience, and community healing. In criminal justice programs across the country, lectures on genealogical DNA often began with Isabella's face projected on the screen, a reminder of the human weight behind scientific progress. Meanwhile, Carmen and Diego were invited to conferences on victims' rights. Standing on stages before strangers, Carmen's soft, trembling words carried farther than she ever imagined. "I am just a mother who wanted answers. If my pain can help another family find theirs, then Izzy's light still shines." Diego's tone was sharper, his anger still raw, but it gave voice to thousands. "My sister fought. She left DNA under her nails. That was her voice, her scream for justice. If not for that, he might still be free today." In Los Cruces, the Herrera family withdrew into near seclusion. Maria Eleanor rarely opened her curtains. Their children avoided public places. Neighbors whispered, in hushed tones torn between sympathy and suspicion. The once beloved family was now a symbol of secrets too heavy to bear. The contrast between the Morales family's public fight for justice and the Herrera family's private implosion underscored the two parallel tragedies, one a loss, the other a betrayal. By winter, news broke that Netflix had greenlit a docuseries titled 17 Years in Silence. Production crews arrived in Albuquerque, filming at the Arroyo, the Rio Grande Trail, the Morales family home, and the courthouse steps. Carmen hesitated at first, fearing exploitation, but Diego convinced her, "If we tell it, in our words, it can't be twisted. It will remind the world who Izzy was not just a victim, but a girl with dreams, a girl who fought." Cameras captured Carmen lighting candles at the plaza, her face lined with years of grief, but illuminated by the flame. Yet even amid attention, grief remained a private torment. Each morning, Carmen still opened Izzy's bedroom door, smoothing the blanket, arranging fresh flowers on the desk. The faint scent of her daughter's perfume lingered, cruel and comforting all at once. Diego often sat at her old desk, reading her unfinished diary entry, "Going on a picnic tomorrow. It'll be fun." His hands shook each time, as though holding the conversation forever cut short. The world celebrated closure, but inside the Morales home, closure did not exist. What existed was endurance, the knowledge that Isabella's story would not fade, that her fight had carried the truth to light, but also the unshakable ache of all the answers Herrera had buried with him in that garage. Justice had arrived, but it would never be enough. And yet, the candle still burned, flickering defiantly against the desert wind, carrying Izzy's name into every corner of memory and history. As 2025 dawned, nearly 18 years after Isabella Morales left home for what was supposed to be a carefree picnic, her story continued to ripple outward. The case was closed, yes, but the impact had only begun. In Albuquerque, Old Town Plaza remained the epicenter of remembrance. Each July 14th, crowds gathered with candles and flowers, but now the vigils drew not dozens, not even hundreds, but thousands. Tourists who had read about the case in newspapers or seen it on television joined locals, holding signs that read "Justice for Izzy and never again." The plaza glowed brighter each year, transforming grief into solidarity. Carmen often stood at the center, voice trembling but steady. "Every candle you light keeps her alive. Every step you take means she is not forgotten." Nationally, Isabella's story became a catalyst for reform. Advocacy groups used her name to push for legislation ensuring that all rape kits, DNA samples, and cold case evidence be processed with the newest technologies. Lawmakers cited her case during debates, repeating the phrase that had echoed through New Mexico, "Justice delayed is justice denied." Funding for forensic laboratories increased, and task forces were formed to re-examine other cold cases languishing in archives. In that way, Izzy's fight lived on, reshaping how America pursued the truth. But beyond policy and headlines, the emotional toll remained unrelenting for the Morales family. Carmen still woke before dawn, walked into Izzy's room, and whispered her daughter's name. The mint green shirt, folded neatly in a drawer, still carried her faint scent. Diego, older now, bore the weight of years lost. He often said, "I should have been her big brother, not her soldier. I should have teased her about crushes, not fought to keep her name alive." His words struck at the cruel reality. While justice named her killer, it also stole their youth, their futures, their chance at a normal life. Miguel Herrera's name faded from public conversation as quickly as it had erupted. His death in a garage left him a shadow a man remembered not for who he was, but for what he took. For some, this felt like justice. For others, a stolen opportunity. Carmen once whispered at a vigil, "He took the answers with him. That's his second crime." The crowd, holding candles, nodded silently. The FBI's review of Herrera's possible connection to other cases remained unresolved, some evidence degraded by time-resisted testing, leaving haunting possibilities unanswered. Yet Izzy's case had become the proof of concept that even after nearly 2 decades, evidence could still speak, that a girl's broken nails could outlast silence. That persistence could turn cold files into fire again. In early 2025, the Netflix docuseries 17 Years in Silence premiered. Its first episode opened with Carmen's trembling voice. She was just going to a picnic. She said she'd be home before dinner. Millions tuned in worldwide. Viewers wept as they watched the community searching along the Rio Grande, the discovery in the Arroyo, and the years of vigils under the desert sky. The final episode ended not with Herrera's suicide, but with Diego's words at the courthouse. Izzy fought, and in the end, her fight exposed him. That was her victory. The series trended for weeks, sparking conversations about justice, technology, and the strength of families who refused to forget. Through it all, Carmen and Diego kept living in the dual reality that defined them, one where Izzy was frozen at 15 and another where her story had changed. Laws inspired millions and reminded the world that silence can be broken. Justice had come, but it was imperfect. Closure never arrived, and yet, against all odds, Isabella's name burned brighter than the man who tried to erase it. At the final vigil filmed for the docuseries, Carmen stood before a sea of candles and whispered, her voice carried by the desert wind, "Izzy, you are remembered. You always will be." The crowd responded in unison, their voices like a vow, justice for Izzy.